From a distance, Socotra can look less like an island than a carefully imagined dream of one. On the horizon, pale limestone rises in hard, sun-bleached layers. Across the dry ground stand dragon's blood trees, their crowns spreading outward like upturned umbrellas, as if the landscape has learned to grow under a different sky. Nearby, swollen bottle trees grip the earth with thick, sculptural trunks that seem almost carved rather than grown. Every ridge, every plateau, every wind-shaped slope adds to the same unnerving impression. This is a place that looks staged from another planet. And yet Socotra is not fantasy. It is real, and it belongs to Yemen, far out in the northwest Indian Ocean. It is also not a single island, but an archipelago stretched across roughly 250 kilometers of sea, with Socotra Island carrying most of the land, and smaller islands and rocky outcrops scattered around it. That geography matters because Socotra's strangeness is not just in how it looks. It is in how life has adapted here, and how many forms of life found their own separate answer to the same harsh environment. That is the first mystery. Why does this place look so different from the Arabian Peninsula to the north, or from the Horn of Africa across the water? Why do its plants seem to have been designed with the logic of survival pushed to an extreme? Why do its reptiles, snails, birds, and reefs tell a story that feels so unlike the one told by the continents around it? At first glance, the answer seems almost too simple. Socotra is isolated. It sits apart, exposed to powerful monsoon winds shaped by ancient geology and cut off long enough for evolution to improvise in unusual directions. But that plain explanation hides a remarkable truth. Isolation did not merely preserve life here, it transformed it. Over immense spans of time, the island became a laboratory where plants and animals were nudged into forms found nowhere else on Earth. That is why Socotra has earned its reputation as one of the planet's strangest living places. The island is famous for the dragon's blood tree, but it is not a one-species wonder. It is a whole web of distinctive life, strange succulents, rare reptiles, endemic land snails, specialized birds, and marine ecosystems tied to the island's coasts and surrounding waters. UNESCO has recognized the archipelago's exceptional biodiversity for the same reason observers are so often left speechless by it. The shapes are unusual, yes, but the deeper surprise is how many separate branches of life, on land and at sea, have followed their own path here. Still, Socotra should not be mistaken for an empty wilderness frozen outside of human history. People have lived here for a very long time, speaking the Socotri language, and shaping the island's land and sea through traditional use. The story of Socotra is not nature alone, but nature and people together, bound into a fragile balance that endured for centuries. That balance is part of what makes the island feel so singular. It is not a museum, it is a living place. And that is what gives Socotra its power. The island's beauty is not just decorative, it is explanatory. The spiky trees, the swollen trunks, the pale stone, the resilient reptiles and snails, the reefs along the coast, all of it feels like a visible record of pressure, distance, and adaptation. This is evolution you can see with your own eyes. So the question is no longer simply why Socotra looks strange. The real question is how a place so remote, so exposed, and so long separated from the rest of the world came to produce such a concentrated burst of difference. The answer begins not with the trees, and not even with the animals, but with the island itself, with the deep history that cut Socotra loose from the world and set it on its own path. To understand why Socotra looks so unlike the world around it, you have to stop thinking in terms of miles and start thinking in terms of oceans, drift, and deep time. The archipelago sits in the northwest Indian Ocean, near the Gulf of Aden, and just off the Horn of Africa, a lonely chain stretched across water that has separated it from the mainland for millions of years. It is not a single island, but a long scatter of land. 4 islands and 2 rocky islets laid out across roughly 250 kilometers. Socotra Island is by far the largest of them, the place where most of the archipelago's life and most of its human history have taken root. That distance matters. In nature, isolation is not just a matter of geography, it is an engine that shapes what can live, what can arrive, and what must evolve on its own. A continent is connected, flooded with species moving in every direction. An island is different. It is selective. It receives only a fraction of the organisms that try to reach it, and the farther it sits from other land, the fewer arrivals it gets. Over long stretches of time, that thin trickle of life becomes the raw material for something extraordinary. A world where local lineages can branch, adapt, and diverge without being constantly overwhelmed by outside competition. Socotra's isolation is especially striking because the island is often described as an ancient continental fragment, a piece of crust separated from the larger landmasses around it, and left to drift in biological solitude. However the exact geological history is described, the broader point is clear. Socotra has been cut off long enough for its living systems to follow their own path. That separation did not just make the island remote. It made it different in the most important way an island can be different. It became a place where evolution was allowed to work with fewer interruptions. This is why Socotra has long fascinated biologists. Islands are natural laboratories for understanding how life spreads, survives, and changes. On a mainland, species can expand their ranges, mix with close relatives, and be continually reshaped by neighboring ecosystems. On an isolated island, the rules are harsher and the experiments are cleaner. A species that arrives by accident may find itself marooned. A population that once belonged to a wider family can slowly become something new. A lineage that survives one era may look utterly unlike its ancestor by the next. Over time, the island begins to collect not just life, but distinct versions of life. Socotra is a case study in that process. Its long separation from surrounding continents helps explain why so many of its plants, reptiles, snails, and other organisms are found nowhere else on Earth. The island does not simply host biodiversity. It concentrates biodiversity into forms that have been shaped by distance. Every successful colonist that reached Socotra entered an environment where isolation, scarcity, and unfamiliar conditions rewarded adaptation. Some species spread into open habitats, others retreated into cliffs, valleys, or pockets of moisture. Still others specialized so completely that they became tied to a narrow corner of the island's landscape. And that landscape itself mattered too. Socotra was never a blank slate. It was a real ancient place with its own rocks, its own soils, its own winds, and its own seasonal extremes. The island's location in a monsoon-influenced sea means that it has always lived under pressure from weather, water, and exposure. In such a setting, even small differences in elevation, rainfall, and shelter can become decisive. One ridge may offer enough moisture for a particular shrub. One sheltered ravine may preserve a relic population. One stretch of coast may favor a species that cannot survive inland. Isolation then amplifies those differences, giving each niche room to become more distinct. That is the deeper logic behind Socotra's strange beauty. The island did not become unusual because life was absent. It became unusual because life was present, but constrained, filtered, and forced to adapt in relative seclusion. Its remoteness did not prevent evolution, it intensified it. What survives on an island like this is not random. It is the result of countless trials against distance, climate, and time. So when Socotra seems to belong to another world, the illusion comes from a very real biological history. The island was cut loose. And once it was cut loose, everything living on it had to answer a new set of rules. That is why the archipelago matters not only as a place of wonder, but as a record of what happens when geography keeps its distance long enough for nature to begin writing its own separate story. And once that story begins, the next question is inevitable. What exactly did that isolation produce? On Socotra, the strange is not an accident. It is a pattern. When biologists talk about endemism, they mean something very simple. A species that exists in only one place on Earth, not almost nowhere, not mostly here, only here. And on Socotra, that idea is not a footnote, it is the main event. That concentration is what makes the archipelago feel so improbable. UNESCO's figures tell the story at a glance. About 37% of the plant species found here are endemic. For reptiles, the number rises to around 90%. For land snails, it climbs even higher, to 95%. In other words, if you pick up a Socotran reptile or land snail, there is a very good chance you are looking at a lineage that evolved in isolation, in place, and nowhere else on the planet followed the same path. This is what long separation does when it is combined with pressure. It does not simply preserve life like a museum behind glass, it reshapes it. On Socotra, species did not evolve in one simple landscape, but in a patchwork of landscapes. There are mountains, limestone plateaus, plains, sand dunes, coastal cliffs, dry valleys, and seasonal streambeds. There are wet monsoon-fed refuges and exposed arid slopes, places that trap moisture and places that burn it away. Each habitat sets its own terms. Each one favors a different strategy for survival. And over immense stretches of time, those different strategies accumulate into different forms. That is how islands manufacture peculiar life. Isolation cuts off easy immigration, so the organisms already present have to adapt rather than rely on reinforcements from elsewhere. Local conditions then divide those populations further. A plant that can survive in a sheltered gorge may not fare well on a wind-blown ridge. A reptile adapted to one microclimate may find another impossible to cross. A snail living in a damp pocket of habitat can become trapped there, and once trapped, it begins to drift genetically away from its relatives. The result is not just diversity, but divergence. Socotra's geology strengthens that process. The archipelago is not a single flat stage on which evolution performs one act. It is a collection of different settings, each with its own soils, elevations, and exposures. That variety matters because it creates many small worlds within one island system. And in small worlds, selection is precise. Traits that improve survival are quickly rewarded. Traits that fail are quickly removed. Over time, the island becomes less like a general landscape and more like a sieve, sorting life into forms that can endure its specific demands. That is why the island's weirdness is so coherent. It is not random ornament, it is evidence of testing. The flora and fauna of Socotra read like answers to repeated questions. How do you hold water when rain is scarce? How do you anchor yourself in thin, dry ground? How do you survive when the wind and the monsoon both become forces of stress rather than comfort? How do you persist when neighbors are few and the nearest outside population is separated by ocean? And the story is not only on land. Socotra's waters are part of the same evolutionary drama. The archipelago supports rich marine communities including corals, reef fish, crabs, lobsters, and shrimp. That matters because isolation did not freeze Socotra into a terrestrial oddity. It shaped an entire island system, from shore to seabed. The surrounding sea is not empty water around a strange rock. It is part of the living architecture of the place, feeding and filtering what can establish there, and giving rise to communities that are adapted to the rhythms of current, temperature, and reef habitat. Seen this way, Socotra is not a single showcase species and a handful of supporting actors. It is a densely layered evolutionary experiment. Its plants, reptiles, snails, birds, and marine life all belong to the same larger logic. Some lineages arrived long ago and changed beyond recognition. Some persisted by narrowing their ecological niche. Some diversified into local forms because the island kept breaking their populations apart. In every case, the common force is pressure, the pressure of isolation, the pressure of climate, the pressure of limited space, the pressure of having to make a life from what the island itself can provide. That is why Socotra can seem otherworldly without being alien. Its surfaces look fantastical because evolution, given enough time and enough constraint, can be fantastical. It produces shapes that seem improbable until you remember what they are doing. They are not trying to be beautiful, they are trying to survive. And once you understand that, the island's famous trees take on a different kind of meaning. They are not just strange silhouettes against a white sky. They are visible proof of a much larger process, one that has been working silently across the archipelago for ages. In the next part of the story, that process becomes impossible to miss because it rises into view in the form of the island's most iconic living symbols. There are places whose identity is distilled into a single image, and Socotra has one of the most recognizable in the world, the dragon's blood tree. From a distance, it looks less like a tree than a living umbrella, or a vast green mushroom lifted above a bare trunk. Its crown spreads in a tight, domed canopy, catching light and shadow in a shape so unusual that it seems designed for a dreamscape rather than a real island. Over time, that silhouette became Socotra's emblem, not because it is the only remarkable plant here, but because it expresses the island's entire evolutionary story in one unforgettable form. The dragon's blood tree is famous for its appearance, but its shape is not decoration. It is adaptation made visible. In a harsh landscape where water is precious and the sun can be punishing, the tree's architecture helps it survive. The umbrella-like canopy shades the ground beneath it, reducing evaporation and offering a small pocket of protection. Its branches rise in a way that seems almost deliberate, built to endure an environment defined by aridity, wind, and periodic assault from the monsoon. Even its strange beauty is functional. On Socotra, appearance is often the outward sign of a deeper bargain with the land. And the dragon's blood tree is only the beginning. Socotra's plant life is not a one-species spectacle. It is an entire botanical community shaped by long isolation and severe environmental pressure. UNESCO recognizes the archipelago for its extraordinary concentration of endemic species, with a remarkable share of its plants found nowhere else on Earth. That means Socotra's flora is not merely unusual in the casual sense. It is the product of a long, separate history, one in which lineages arrived, adapted, diverged, and sometimes persisted in forms that feel like survivors from another age. The island's vegetation includes not just the famous dragon's blood tree, but other endemic plants, hardy shrubs, succulents, and relict species that point back to ancient ecological patterns now largely erased elsewhere. Some of these plants store water in fleshy trunks or swollen stems. Some reduce their leaves or shed them under stress. Some hug the ground to escape the wind. Others grow slowly, patiently, investing in survival rather than speed. In a place where fresh water is limited and the climate can swing between dry heat and storm-driven hardship, there is little room for waste. The island's plants have been selected not for extravagance, but for resilience. Their forms are strange because the conditions that shape them are strange. Their oddness is not a gimmick, it is a record. That record is written in branches, trunks, roots, and leaves. It is written in bottle-shaped forms that store moisture, in tough tissues that can endure exposure, in growth habits that make sense only when you understand how little water the island can reliably offer. Socotra's flora has had to negotiate more than drought. It has had to contend with wind, salt, thin soils, and the seasonal violence of the monsoon cycle. Plants here do not simply live in the landscape. They answer it. They conform to it. They are sculpted by it. That is why the island can look so surreal from a human perspective. We see a tree like the dragon's blood tree and think first of fantasy, of something invented. But the island's plants are not fantasies at all. They are survival strategies disguised as spectacle. Each unusual form is an ecological solution. Each emblematic silhouette is a compromise between what the environment demands and what life can manage to become. This is also what makes Socotra's flora so emotionally powerful. The trees feel iconic because they are legible. You can read the struggle in them. You can sense almost immediately that these are not ordinary landscapes plants placed in an ordinary setting. They belong to a living system that has been isolated long enough to produce its own rules, its own rhythms, and its own cast of botanical characters. The island becomes memorable not just because it is beautiful, but because its beauty has an argument behind it. It says that endurance can be elegant. It says that survival can produce forms no one would have predicted. But there is another side to that same story. The more specialized a species becomes, the more tightly it can be bound to the conditions that made it possible. A tree that depends on a narrow climate balance, a plant community that has adapted to a specific pattern of wind and moisture, a species that evolved in relative isolation. Each one can be vulnerable when the balance shifts. Endemics are not just unique, they are often exposed. If a disturbance is broad enough or persistent enough, there may be nowhere else for them to go. That fragility gives Socotra's beauty a different emotional weight. The island's plants are not museum pieces preserved behind glass. They are living organisms still trying to make their way through a changing world. Their surreal forms are the result of deep time, but their future depends on present conditions that are becoming less stable. The trees that made Socotra famous are not isolated icons standing above the rest of the ecosystem. They are part of a wider web of plants, soil, water, insects, and people, each linked to the others by a balance that has held with difficulty for ages. And that balance is not controlled by the plants alone. To understand why these trees look the way they do, and why they are so hard to replace if they are lost, we have to move from the symbols themselves to the forces that shape them every day. On Socotra, the next great sculptor is not just evolution. It is weather, stone, and the relentless pressure of survival. If the trees gave Socotra its face, the weather gives it its pulse. The island sits in the northwest Indian Ocean at the edge of two great seasonal systems, and that rhythm is what makes daily life here so demanding. For part of the year, the summer southwest monsoon drives hard winds and rough seas across the archipelago, while the winter northeast monsoon brings a different circulation, a different light, and a different pattern of moisture. The result is not a gentle tropical climate, but a place where the sky changes the terms of survival again and again. Socotra is also a landscape of sharp contrasts. Much of the archipelago is arid, with coastal lowlands and elevated plateaus that remain dry for long stretches, while the granite mountains of the interior intercept moisture and create wetter refuges above the plains. Scientists studying the island's climate describe the winter northeast winds as especially important on the windward side of the Hagahur Mountains, where orographic lift wrings out what little rainfall is available. In other words, the island is not uniformly dry or uniformly wet. It is a patchwork of microclimates, and each one draws a boundary around what can live there. That matters because water on Socotra does not behave like water in a stable, temperate landscape. It arrives irregularly, moving through wadis and temporary streams, then vanishing into rock, soil, and evaporation. In the higher eastern and mountain zones, the terrain can hold moisture longer, and even fog becomes part of the island's water budget. On the plains and limestone plateaus, by contrast, survival depends on waiting, conserving, and enduring. A plant rooted in the wrong hollow or an animal born outside the narrow range where shade and moisture overlap may simply fail. Seen this way, Socotra's strange-looking life forms are not decorative oddities. They are answers. Thick stems, narrow leaves, deep roots, water-storing tissues, and timing strategies all make sense in a place where heat, wind, and drought can arrive in force and then retreat just as suddenly. Even within the same island, species are sorted by exposure, elevation, and access to seasonal moisture. The famous dragon's blood tree may symbolize the island, but it is only one expression of a much broader rule. On Socotra, every living thing has to negotiate with the physical world constantly, and only those adapted to very specific tolerances can hold their ground. The island's climate also helps explain why its ecology is so fragmented and so specialized. Areas with more reliable water support richer aquatic habitats, and researchers have found that dragonfly diversity, for example, is highest where suitable water is available through the year, especially in the wetter east. That pattern repeats across the island's living systems. Moisture gathers in some valleys, lingers on some slopes, and disappears from others, creating islands within the island. Socotra is not a single environment but a chain of survival zones, each one small enough to be fragile and distinct enough to shape evolution in its own direction. And once you start to see the island that way, the next mystery becomes unavoidable. If the land and weather have produced such narrow specialists onshore, what kind of life has learned to endure around the coast, in the reefs, and beyond the cliffs? If the plants of Socotra seem to belong to a storybook from another world, the animals make the same argument in a different language. Here, evolution did not stop at the trees. It spread across the rock, the soil, the cliffs, and the sea, leaving behind a living catalog of specialists so unusual that the island's difference becomes impossible to dismiss as a trick of scenery. On Socotra, the oddness is systemic. It is written into the reptiles that dart across the stone, the snails hidden in damp crevices, the birds that arrive and depart with the seasons, and the reefs fringing the coast below. UNESCO's figures tell part of that story with startling clarity. A very high share of Socotra's reptile species are found nowhere else on Earth, and the same is true for its land snails. That kind of endemism does not happen overnight. It takes long separation, stable enough niches for lineages to persist, and enough time for populations to drift apart, adapt, and specialize without being constantly blended back into a larger continent's gene pool. Socotra's isolation gave that process room to unfold. Its terrain and climate then broke the island into small ecological pockets, each one acting like a separate experiment in survival. In those pockets, reptiles and snails did not just endure, they diverged. Reptiles are especially good witnesses to this kind of evolutionary isolation because they are often tied to precise microhabitats, a particular slope, a patch of shade, a certain kind of stone, a temperature range, a season of moisture. On Socotra, those boundaries matter. A rocky hillside can support a different set of species from a sandy wash or a scrubby plateau. A crevice that catches a little more dampness can become a refuge, and a ridge exposed to the wind can become a filter that only the hardiest forms can cross. Over long periods, those small barriers add up, The result is not simply a greater number of animals, but a more intricate map of dependence, where life is distributed in narrow threads rather than broad blankets. The same logic applies to the island's land snails, which may seem humble until you realize how much they reveal. Snails move slowly, disperse reluctantly, and depend on moisture that is often scarce. That makes them sensitive to isolation, but it also makes them excellent record keepers of it. Where the landscape is broken into wet pockets and dry gaps, populations can separate and remain separate for long stretches of time. Socotra's remarkable snail diversity is a sign that these conditions have been in place long enough for species to accumulate and specialize, each one adapted to a niche so specific that a small change in rainfall, vegetation, or disturbance can put its future at risk. Above the ground and beyond the shrubs, the island is also part of a wider aerial world. Birds turn Socotra from an isolated landmass into a meeting point. Some come to breed, some pass through on migration, and some use the archipelago as a temporary shelter in a vast network of movement that stretches far beyond the island's horizons. That makes Socotra both a refuge and a crossroads. For breeding birds, cliffs, ledges, and coastal spaces offer places to raise young away from some mainland pressures. For migrants, the island can function as a waypoint in a journey measured not in miles alone, but in exhausted wings, changing winds, and the narrow windows when food and rest are available. In that sense, Socotra's bird life is part of a larger rhythm, one that links the island to Africa, Arabia, and the broader Indian Ocean. Then there is the sea, which completes the picture and makes it even stranger. Socotra is not only a world of oddly shaped trees and rare land creatures. Its surrounding waters extend the same pattern offshore, where corals, coastal fish, and countless small invertebrates form another realm of adaptation. Coral communities and shallow marine habitats around the archipelago support life that depends on the balance of light, temperature, currents, and clear water. Along the coast, fish and invertebrates occupy their own specialized roles, woven into reef edges, tidal zones, and sheltered shallows. Just as the island's valleys and cliffs create terrestrial microworlds, the coastal environment creates marine ones, each shaped by local conditions and each vulnerable when those conditions shift. That is what makes Socotra so important and so fragile. Specialization is a gift with a hidden cost. The very traits that allow a species to survive in a narrow niche can also make it less resilient when the niche changes. A reptile adapted to one kind of rock or one pattern of moisture may struggle if habitat is disturbed. A snail dependent on persistent dampness may be unable to recover from longer dry periods. Birds tied to specific breeding sites can be affected when human pressure, weather, or resource scarcity alters those sites. Coral and reef life face their own limits, especially when heat, pollution, or disruption nudge the marine environment away from the conditions that built it. So Socotra's uniqueness should not be understood as a single spectacle, or even as a collection of curiosities. It is a whole evolutionary system, one in which land and sea seem to have diversified in parallel, each producing its own specialists under the same long isolation. The dragon's blood tree may be the island's most recognizable emblem, but it is only one signature in a much larger script. The true story is the accumulation of narrow, beautiful dependencies. A lizard under a stone, a snail in a damp fold, a bird riding the wind, a coral living at the edge of what the sea allows. Together they reveal an island where life has learned to fill every available niche, and where every niche has a name, a history, and a limit. And once that becomes clear, Socotra starts to look less like an untouched wilderness than something more revealing. A landscape where nature and human life have been entwined for far longer than the outside world has usually remembered. It is easy, looking at Socotra from a distance, to imagine that its strange trees and empty-looking slopes belong to nature alone. But that image leaves out the people who have lived here for centuries, speaking a language, following seasons, and reading the island as carefully as any biologist ever could. Socotra is not only a refuge for rare plants and animals. It is a lived-in landscape, shaped by memory, movement, and necessity. Its beauty is not separate from human life. In many ways, it was formed by it. At the center of that story is the Socotri language, one of the island's most distinctive cultural inheritances. It is part of the same deep isolation that helped produce Socotra's unusual biology. Just as the island's species evolved on their own terms, so too did its human culture develop with a remarkable degree of continuity. Language, place names, oral knowledge, and local practices became a kind of living archive, carrying information about wind, rain, pasture, tides, and the uses of plants. On an island where the environment can be severe and the seasons can be unforgiving, knowing the land was never optional. It was survival. For a long time, that survival depended on a balance between people and place that changed more slowly than it might have elsewhere. UNESCO notes that traditional land and sea use on Socotra remained relatively unchanged until the 1970s, and that matters enormously. It means the island's human communities were not simply extracting from a static wilderness. They were participating in a system that had settled into rhythm over generations. People moved with the island's logic. Herds were guided to where grazing would last. Families adjusted to water, weather, and terrain. Coastal life and inland life each had their own knowledge, and both were tied to the island's seasons. Pastoralism was one of the essential threads in that pattern. Goats, in particular, have long been part of Socotri life, and the movement of herders across the island helped define where pressure fell and where land could recover. This was not a machine-like form of land use, but a deeply local one, built on observation. Transhumance, the seasonal movement between different grazing areas, allowed people and animals to follow the island's changing conditions rather than fight them. That kind of mobility shaped not only livelihoods but landscapes. Paths were remembered, water sources were guarded, certain places were known for shelter, others for forage, others for danger. The island was mapped in human habits as much as in geography, and the famous trees were never only symbols. The dragon's blood tree, with its umbrella canopy and red resin, may look like a botanical emblem from another world, but on Socotra, it was part of everyday reality. So were the bottle-shaped desert roses, the frankincense relatives, the grasses and shrubs that fed animals, and the plants that marked seasons, slopes, or sources of shelter. A species could be admired for its beauty and still be useful. Resin could be collected. Wood could matter, shade could matter. Leaves, roots, fruit, and sap could all have roles in a system of knowledge that was practical, local, and cumulative. The island's people did not experience these plants as museum pieces. They lived among them as tools, landmarks, medicines, and signs. That is why Socotra's conservation story cannot be told honestly as though nature and culture were separate things. The island's biodiversity was not preserved in spite of human presence. It was maintained through a long relationship between people and environment, a relationship that depended on restraint, adaptation, and intimate knowledge. When that balance held, it helped sustain both ecological diversity and cultural continuity. When it weakened, the whole system became more fragile. This is the larger lesson Socotra offers. Its uniqueness is not just a matter of rare species surviving on an isolated island. It is a record of cohabitation. The island's birds, reptiles, snails, trees, shepherds, fishers, and storytellers all belong to the same historical landscape. Each has depended on the others indirectly, through climate, soil, water, and use. To understand Socotra only as a biological wonder is to miss the human intelligence that helped shape it. To understand it only as a cultural place is to miss the evolutionary strangeness that made that culture possible. The island is both at once. That is also why modern conservation on Socotra is so difficult. Protecting the island is not just about drawing boundaries around rare habitats. It is about preserving the conditions that allowed a human nature system to function for so long. Language matters because it carries ecological memory. Pastoral practice matters because it organizes land use. Local stewardship matters because it links survival to care. And when those things are disrupted, the consequences spread far beyond any single species or site. For much of its history, Socotra's remoteness helped protect that balance. It slowed the arrival of change. It gave the island time to remain itself. But isolation is not the same as immunity. The same distance that once sheltered Socotra from the pace of the outside world now makes it especially sensitive to whatever reaches it next. The island's old balance was never permanent. It was only durable as long as the patterns that sustained it could continue. And now, as those patterns begin to shift, the question is no longer how Socotra became so unusual. The question is how long a place this singular can keep its shape once the forces around it begin to move faster than its traditions ever did. Socotra's strangeness has always been its strength. The same forces that set it apart, its long isolation, its hard climate, its strange geology, the slow work of evolution, also made it one of the most remarkable ecological places on Earth. But in nature, what takes millions of years to build can be unsettled in a matter of decades. On an island like this, change does not arrive evenly. It arrives all at once. That is why the future of Socotra is so precarious. Climate change can shift rainfall, intensify drought, and strain the delicate rhythms that plants and animals have adapted to over vast stretches of time. Unsustainable use of resources can wear down soils, reduce regeneration, and weaken the living systems that hold the landscape together. Tourism, if it grows too quickly or without care, can bring pressure to places that were never designed to absorb it. And beyond the environment itself, social disruption can make conservation even harder because no ecosystem survives in isolation from the people who live within it. This is the hidden truth behind islands of endemism. The very conditions that allow species to evolve nowhere else also make them vulnerable in ways that are hard to reverse. When a species exists only on one island or in one valley or on one mountain slope, there is no second population waiting somewhere else to repopulate the loss. Once that balance is broken, the disappearance can be permanent. On Socotra, where so much life is found nowhere else on Earth, every disturbance carries more than local consequences. It carries the risk of erasing something irreplaceable from the planet itself. And yet Socotra is not simply a story of decline waiting to happen. It is also a story of attention and of effort. UNESCO and its partners have continued working on conservation, sustainable tourism, and the protection of the island's cultural heritage, including its language and the relationship between people and land. That matters because Socotra is not a museum frozen in time. It is a living place, and the challenge is not to preserve it in perfect stillness, but to keep the connections intact that have allowed it to endure for so long. Those connections are everything here. The trees depend on rainfall patterns. The reptiles depend on intact habitats. The snails depend on the narrow conditions that shaped them. The people depend on the land and sea, and the land and sea depend, in turn, on how carefully they are used. Socotra's future will not be decided by wonder alone. It will be decided by whether that web of life remains strong enough to hold. So when we call Socotra another planet, we are really describing a place that is deeply, unmistakably earthly. It is a story of isolation, adaptation, and survival. A story written by wind and stone, but also by people, memory, and restraint. And now, as the pressures around it grow, the question is no longer whether Socotra is extraordinary. The question is whether a place this singular can keep its shape while the world beyond it changes faster than its oldest rhythms were ever meant to move.